Welcome to episode 13 of Action RPG in Unity, GridInventory Part 1. Okay, welcome everyone to Part 1 of GridInventory for Action RPG tutorial. In this episode we will implement a grid inventory in style of Diablo or Path of Exile or Sacred. I actually already have a pretty big tutorial about how to make grid inventory in Unity. This episode will be using that episode as a basis. You do not need to watch other video. We will adapt the scripts and concepts of that video for needs of Action RPG styled inventory. Let's begin by adding PNG images for grid and a bunch of other icons for items. I made those two tiles. One is just a tile, and another one is white tile, which we will use for highlighting later on. You can find link to all the free files I used in this tutorial in the description, or you can draw your own. What is important when you are drawing is to write up the size of this image. So the size of one of my tile is 32 by 32 and keep it as square. So all sides have to be equal. Okay. Now let's set up those tiles. Select them, set texture type to be Sprite. For the tile and white tile, set wrap mode to be repeat. Select all sprites, set compression and filter mode as none, and point no filter, to avoid smearing your tiles and items icon because of compression. Set pivot to be top left, apply the changes. Good, so we have set our tile wrap to repeat. Place the tile on the canvas by creating an image on the canvas. Make sure you create an UI element, which you can make sure by checking if it has rect transform instead of just transform in the inspector. Let's set it to be tiled. You will see this. If I resize the image right now, it will expand the field of tiles. I made a mistake. For UI you need to keep your pixel per unit to be 100. So let's fix this by selecting all icons and setting pixel per unit to 100. So let's say you want to make 10 by 10 cells inventory. Easy. Set anchor to the top left corner. Set pivot to be top left of the inventory. Open the anchor panel. Hold shift click on top left. So if you remember, size of one of my tile is 32, so let's set width and height 32. That will make a grid 1 by 1. To make inventory 10 by 10, we need to multiply the size of our tile by 10. That will make 320 by 320, which means it is 10 by 10 inventory. 3 by 3 will be 96 by 96, and another example is 5 by 3, 160 by 96. So let's make 16 by 7 inventory, or any other size you want. Rename it into inventory grid. Do not parent this object to anything besides canvas. We will deal with parenting later on. Good, create another new component called itemGrid. Open the newly created script. Inside the script we will be storing all information about the grid, what it contains, and all the methods and functions to interact with. So create a new method called getGridPosition, which will return position of the tile on the grid as type vector2int. This method will determine the tile on the grid we are currently selecting based on the mouse position on the screen. Pass mouse position as a parameter. So we have a mouse position and grid is a sprite on the screen. What we want to do is to take the mouse position and convert it into the position of tile on the grid. To do this we need to know the size of the tile. So create two constant variables of type float called tile size width and tile size height. With the value of the size of your tile, in our case it is 32. Now we need to convert the mouse position to the position inside the tile grid. You need to use left bottom as 0 position for the mouse. Let's see it visually. Make the vector2 variable and post it on the screen using onGUI label. As you can see, bottom left is 0,0 position for the mouse, while top right is target resolution of the game. So we need to place anchor for the grid to bottom left. Then we need to find top left corner position of the grid itself, so the pivot of the grid must be in the top left corner. And then using simple math we can find the position of the tile on the grid. So let's do this. First make sure we move the anchor to the bottom left. We already moved the pivot of the object into top left position, but just to double check, make sure that your pivot point is in X0 position and Y1 position. Open the itemGrid script. Create new variable called mouse position on grid of type vector2. And on awake, cache the reference to the rect transform. This will allow us to read the object position, which on screen will be the top left point of the grid. Inside the getGrid position, we want to calculate the position of the mouse inside the grid. Notice that I'm not talking about the tile position of the tile. I'm talking specifically about current mouse position, specifically inside the bounds of this grid object. So to calculate position on the grid for x value, subtract rect transform position x from mouse position x. And for position y, subtract mouse position y from rect transform position y. Future Greg here, I made a mistake. Here it should be Y instead of X. We will fix it later. Let's check if our calculation is correct by posting mouse position on the grid on GUI label. Then we want to calculate tile grid position, create a new variable called tile grid position. Then calculate X and Y position of the tile on the grid by dividing the position on the grid by the size of the tile. Let's rename the method into getTileGridPosition. And to test this, let's add the label. Something is off. Oh, I accidentally put X position instead of Y. My bad, I'm sorry. Good, as you can see, our position on the grid is properly calculated. Let's remove testing out of our grid component. For optimization, let's pull out the tile grid position out of the get tile grid position. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. You will get cool perks like being featured like those cool people you can see right now on your screen, or access to project files. Return to the editor and create another new script called inventory controller. This script will be responsible for all the interaction player will be doing with all the inventory grids. Create a serialized field called selected item grid. Assign it in the editor. In the update, we will add the exit gate in case we have no selected item grid assigned. and then call getTileGridPosition. Pass what is being returned into the debug log. Let's test this. Good, as you can see it worked. If I hover over grid, it shows the correct position on the grid. Good, now we want to make it so when we are hovering outside the grid, it will not be executing getTileGridPosition. So select grid object and create another new component called GridInteract. This script will be responsible for making grid as being interactable. In case this component is not present or turned off on the object, it should make it so this grid is not interactable and can't receive player input. Inside the script we need to cache the reference to the inventory controller. On the start, use find object of type inventory controller. This is not very efficient way to do this, but for now it will suffice. Later on you might want to look into ways to optimize this out of your game. Now I want to import event system, so we will be able to use iPointer enter handle interface and iPointer exit handle interface. Implement those interfaces. To demonstrate what those interfaces are doing, let's add debug message and test it. Remove the position debug message and launch the game. As you can see, the moment I enter the grid with my mouse, it reports that pointer has entered the grid, and when I'm out, it says pointer exit. Now what we want to do is to replace the selected grid on the inventory controller if pointer is hovering over the grid. In the inventory controller, make the selected grid public. In the GridInteract, cache the item grid. Set the selected item grid on inventory controller if we hover over the GridInteract, and make it null if we're exiting out of the item grid. Because this component is dependent on existence of item grid, add the required component attribute. In inventory controller, let's bring back the debug log with getTileGridPosition. Because of our implementation, it should only post position in debug if we are hovering over the tile grid. Remove the reference to the item grid in the editor. As you can see, debug is posting position only if we are hovering over the grid, because it is being selected as you can see in the inspector, all thanks to this exit gate inside the inventory controller. You can see how grid is being selected if we play not maximized in the inspector. So let's put the debug message into simple check for mouse button click. To avoid possible misunderstandings, let's hide in the inspector select item grid. This is useful to do if you are working in team and don't want someone else get confused that he has to assign the reference to this field. Good, this is it for this episode. Special thank you to HMay, The Salt Hashdo for their generous support. With best regards, see you in the next episode.